He returned from the war wounded and almost broken. Together with his faithful dog, he found an abandoned family hotel in the mountains. There, where there was only ruin and silence, he built a new home and a place where weary travelers were drawn. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The road that led away from the city twisted like an old scar through the foothills, each curve carrying Natan Ellis farther from the life he no longer recognized. He kept one hand steady on the worn steering wheel of his pickup, and the other draped over the head of the German Shepherd, sprawled across the passenger seat. Archie slept lightly, ears flicking to every subtle sound that drifted through the half-open window. Beyond the glass stretched miles of pine and spruce, their dark needles dripping with early spring rain and a sky the color of steel. For the first time in years, Natan felt the hum of anticipation rising beneath the weight of exhaustion. It wasn't joy exactly, he had forgotten what that felt like, but a faint stirring of purpose. He didn't know what waited for him at the end of the road, but it had to be better than the slow collapse he had endured since coming home from war. Once, his life had been built around clear commands and unbreakable bonds. In the Army, he had been a handler in a combat canine unit, working alongside Archie through endless training exercises and tense deployments. Together, they had swept roads for hidden explosives, tracked fleeing insurgents across unforgiving terrain, and guarded men who trusted the dog's nose more than any metal detector. It had been a life of precision and purpose, defined by loyalty and skill. Then came the mission that ended everything, a dirt road in Afghanistan, a day too quiet for comfort, a flash of movement where there should have been none. The blast tore through the air before Natan could react. He remembered the crushing force, the ringing silence afterward, and Archie's body over his, teeth bared at invisible enemies, dragging him by his vest out of a kill zone, while Natan's leg went numb and useless. The surgeon saved the limb, but could not restore what war had taken. Months of rehabilitation followed, hours of physical therapy, endless pain, the humiliating return to walking with a brace. The military sent him home with a pension and an honorable discharge, and for a time he believed he could build something new. But the city felt alien. Friends had moved on, their conversations awkward and full of pity. Strangers either stared at the limp or looked away too quickly. Job interviews dissolved when employers saw the cane or learned that he could not stand for long hours. More than once he caught himself sitting in his apartment long after sunset, staring at nothing, while Archie nudged his hand, as if reminding him that he was still here, still needed. It was one of those empty nights when memory returned like an unexpected flare. He thought of the mountains of his boyhood, of weekends, when his grandfather would drive him and his sister up winding roads to an old lodge perched high among the pines. Pine Summit Lodge, the sign had once read in proud green letters. His grandfather built it in the 70s, a haven for hikers and travelers who wanted rustic comfort and honest mountain air. After the old man died, no one kept it running. Natan's parents had sold the easier assets and let the property rot. Too remote, too costly to revive. But the idea took hold in Natan's mind with quiet persistence. Maybe that forgotten place could become a refuge, not just for him, but from everything. He had nothing left to lose. So he packed what he could fit: a set of battered tools, clothes, camping gear, a box of keepsakes that had survived deployments and divorce from a life he barely remembered. Archie jumped into the truck without hesitation. They left before dawn, driving west until the city shrank behind them and the mountains grew. The climb into the Rockies felt both familiar and strange. The air thinned, colder and sharper with each mile. Snow lingered in the shadows, even though spring had crept across the lower valleys. The old forest road that branched toward the lodge had been left to the weather for decades. Potholes jarred the truck's suspension. Fallen branches forced detours. Natan drove slowly, jaw tight with concentration, sometimes stopping to cut away a limb or shift stones. Archie watched the tree line with restless focus, ears pricking at unseen wildlife. Each mile felt like peeling away a layer of his former life, leaving only the man who wanted to see if he could still build something with his hands. When they finally broke through to the clearing, Natan cut the engine and just sat. Before him stood what remained of Pine Summit Lodge. Once it must have been charming. 2 stories of heavy timber with a broad wraparound porch and a steep roof meant to shed mountain snow. Now it sagged under years of neglect. The shingles were mostly gone, boards warped and blackened with rot, and the grand porch where his grandfather had sat to greet guests had collapsed in places. Windows gaped empty like sockets, and the sign had fallen, half buried in pine needles. The silence around the place was almost complete, broken only by the wind threading through broken rafters and the creak of a loose shutter. To the right stood a squat garage with doors barely hanging on their rusted hinges. Something about it tugged at memory. Natan limped over, pulled one door aside with effort, and let light spill onto a forgotten relic. His grandfather's Jeep Wagoneer, boxy and noble even under decades of dust. Its tires were flat, paint dulled to a ghost of its former dark green. But the shape was whole. He remembered rides in that car, bouncing along mountain tracks with his grandfather's laughter booming above the engine. For a long moment he just stood, the smell of rust and old oil thick in the air, while Archie sniffed carefully along the concrete floor, as though cataloging the past. The first night was hard. Natan cleared a small space in the least damaged room, unrolled his sleeping bag, and lit a single lantern. The air inside was cold and damp, smelling of mice and wood long soaked in rain. Outside, the forest whispered, a deep, steady sound that felt both protective and unsettling. Archie lay close, head on paws, but eyes always scanning. Sleep came in fits. Natan dreamed of sand and fire, and woke to find himself sweating in the mountain chill. Yet beneath the unease was a spark he hadn't felt in years. Here was a challenge that belonged to no commander, no bureaucracy, no judge of his worth. This ruin was his to shape. He traced the scars on his leg absently, and wondered if rebuilding this place might rebuild something inside him as well. Morning arrived with a pale light creeping through broken windows, and the smell of pine carried by cold air. Natan stepped outside with his first cup of instant coffee, leaning on his cane, and looked at the lodge in full daylight. The wood still had strength in its bones. He could see it beneath the moss and weathering. The stone foundation stood solid, stubbornly resisting the decades. The garage held more than the Jeep-old tools, rusted nails, stacks of forgotten lumber that might be coaxed into usefulness. He felt an unfamiliar stirring, not optimism exactly, but the faint conviction that maybe he wasn't finished yet. Archie bounded into the clearing, tail high, as if sensing his master's shift. For the first time in a long while, Natan allowed himself a thin smile. He spent the rest of that first day exploring every corner of the property. The main hall was a mess of fallen beams, cracked stone hearth, and scattered furniture gnawed by rodents. Upstairs, once cozy guest rooms were shells, with peeling wallpaper and shattered glass. The plumbing was ruined, and whatever wiring had once existed dangled like dead vines. But through the decay he saw possibilities. The grand fireplace could roar again. The porch could welcome travelers. The rooms could hold warmth instead of mildew. He imagined hikers stumbling upon the place after a long trek, grateful for shelter. He imagined a life defined not by survival, but by creation. By evening, he had cleared a small path to the creek behind the lodge for water and gathered dry wood for a fire in the courtyard pit his grandfather had built long ago. He cooked a simple meal on a camp stove while Archie dozed, then watched the stars ignite one by one in the cold mountain sky. The silence felt different now, not hostile, but waiting. He thought about the man he had become after the blast, hollowed by pain and failure, and about the boy who had once believed the world was wide and buildable. Maybe, he thought, the two could meet here. As darkness wrapped the mountain, Natan sat against a fallen beam and let the fire crackle low. The lodge loomed behind him, wounded, but standing, a mirror of himself. He didn't know how long it would take to breathe life back into this place, or whether he had the strength to see it through. But for the first time since leaving the battlefield, the thought of tomorrow felt like something worth waking for. Archie shifted closer, pressing his warm flank against Natan's leg, and together they faced the night. Not as soldiers, not as ghosts, but as two survivors on the edge of something new. Morning came pale and cold, the kind of light that seeps rather than shines, and Natan Ellis woke to the creak of timbers above his head. The room where he and Archie had slept smelled of damp wood and age-old dust. His first breath was sharp with the chill, and his leg ached before he even moved. Still, he pushed himself upright, rubbing the stiff scar tissue through worn fabric. Outside, the mountains were quiet except for the occasional croak of a raven somewhere in the treetops. The fire pit where he had sat the night before was a mound of gray ash, and the ruined lodge stood before him in full, merciless daylight. It was worse than it had seemed by firelight. Shingles curled like dead leaves, gaps in the walls exposed dark, moldy insulation, and whole sections of the porch tilted dangerously. For a long moment, he wondered if he had been foolish to come. Yet there was no going back. The road behind him felt closed in every way that mattered. He had left the city not just to escape its noise, but to escape the slow suffocation of pity and purposelessness. Here, there were no easy exits, no bureaucrats to tell him no neighbors to watch his decline. Only the mountain, the wreck of his family's lodge, and a dog who trusted him without question. He took a deep breath of pine-scented air and decided to start. The first task was to understand what he faced. Natan spent the early hours limping through every hallway, tapping with a hammer handle, testing beams with his weight, and making rough notes in a battered notebook. The stone foundation had held up better than expected, tight and dry, despite decades of freeze and thaw. The main log walls, though weathered and missing much of their chinking, still felt strong under his palm. But the roof was a disaster. Entire sections sagged, some collapsed outright. Inside, rooms smelled of mildew and rodent nests, floors bowed where moisture had seeped too long. Plumbing was gone, copper stripped or burst. Wires hung useless. Each discovery was another reminder of how far gone the lodge was, and how far he would have to climb back. His body protested with every step. The wounded leg stiffened whenever he crouched or lifted, and by midday, the ache had deepened into a grinding throb. Sweat cooled quickly in the mountain air, chilling him. More than once he had to stop and lean against a doorframe, breathing through clenched teeth, while Archie pressed close, dark eyes watching with canine patience. There was a dangerous whisper in his head, telling him he was broken, that this was more than he could do. But he forced himself to keep moving, one inspection after another, until he knew the enemy he faced. By afternoon, he had chosen a starting point. The garage. It was the least damaged structure, and would become his base of operations. The doors screeched in protest when he forced them wide, letting in sunlight that painted motes of dust gold. He began by clearing decades of debris, Old boxes collapsed into themselves, rusted paint cans, forgotten snow shovels. Each armload tested his balance. Each drag of a rotten plank flared pain up his thigh. But as the space opened, he felt a small current of satisfaction. He could control this. He could make one thing whole before tackling the rest. And in the far corner waited the Jeep. Its hood was coated in dust, so thick his hand left a clean trail when he touched it. The tires were flat to the rims, but the frame seemed intact. The thought of resurrecting the old Wagoneer stirred something deeper than practicality. It was memory rides with his grandfather on these same roads, the smell of oil and pine, the way the old man's hands had seemed capable of fixing anything. Natan spent that evening hunched over the engine bay, lantern light flickering on rust and steel, cataloging what could be salvaged. He would need parts belts, filters, maybe an entire carburetor, but the core was there. If he could bring the Jeep back to life, maybe he could believe in his own. The next days fell into a grueling rhythm. Sunrise woke him early, and he forced himself to stretch and walk despite the legs' protests. He cleaned and sorted tools, patched what little roof he could to keep rain out of his sleeping corner, and returned to the Jeep whenever he lacked the strength for heavier labor. Archie became his silent partner, fetching dropped gloves, warning with low growls when deer or raccoons crept too close, curling beside him when exhaustion forced a break. In the quiet of the garage, Natan's mind wandered to places he usually avoided, memories of the battlefield, of the blast, of comrades he hadn't seen since. Some days the silence broke under the weight of those ghosts, and he had to step outside, breathing hard, while Archie leaned against his hip as if to keep him upright. It wasn't only the past that tested him. The mountain had its own lessons to deliver. One week a storm rolled in without warning, sweeping the ridge with sleet and shrieking wind. Natan barely managed to secure loose panels before the sky split open. Rain hammered the roof until water poured through gaps he hadn't yet sealed. He spent the night awake, shifting buckets to catch leaks, listening to the moan of timbers. By morning, half the work he had done seemed undone. Another day, he returned from hauling water to find chaos. A black bear had followed scent to his meager food supplies, shredding boxes, scattering cans into the yard. Archie's furious barking had kept the beast from breaking into the main lodge, but the damage was done. Natan stared at the wreckage, heart pounding with fear and rage. He had thought himself prepared. He was not. That night, he sat by a weak fire, wet and sore, and felt despair wash over him like the cold rain. For long minutes he considered driving back down the mountain, abandoning this mad plan. But Archie rested his chin on Natan's knee, steady and warm, and something inside the man refused to yield. Slowly, resilience took root. Each failure became a lesson. He rebuilt the food storage, this time with heavy steel containers and strict cleanliness to discourage curious animals. He studied the local weather and began to read the sky more like a soldier reading terrain. The next supply run down the mountain, though painful and slow, brought not just food, but proper roofing materials, new tools, and replacement parts for the Jeep. The grizzled owner of the hardware store eyed him with mild curiosity, but said nothing when Natan hauled sheet metal to his truck with quiet determination. The drive back up was long and grueling, but when he parked again before the lodge, the truck loaded with possibility, he felt a small surge of pride. Work on the roof became an all-consuming battle. Balancing on aching legs atop sagging beams was dangerous and exhausting. More than once he slipped and caught himself with a hammer still clutched in his fist. But day by day, he stripped away rotten shingles and replaced them with new panels. Each clang of the hammer seemed to strike not only nails, but doubts. When he finally sealed the last seam and stepped back to see the main structure secure against rain and snow, the feeling was unlike anything he'd known in years. He had built something again, not as a soldier, not as a failed job seeker, but as a man reclaiming his own competence. Inside, he turned his attention to warmth. The grand hearth in the main hall had been choked with rubble. He cleared it stone by stone, swept decades of ash, and repaired the cracked flue. The first night he coaxed a fire to life there. The hall glowed with a soft amber light, shadows dancing over stripped walls. He and Archie sat before it in silence, the dog's head resting on his thigh. Outside, the wind keened, and pine branches scraped the windows. But within those walls, for the first time, there was comfort. The lodge wasn't whole yet, not even close, but it was no longer just a ruin. It was a shelter. In the weeks that followed, progress came in fits and starts. His leg would betray him some mornings, swelling until he could barely stand. Supplies ran low and forced painful drives down to the valley. Once, a fallen tree blocked the rough road entirely and cost him 2 days of sawing and hauling just to pass. Yet alongside every frustration came small victories: a repaired stairwell, a cleared hallway, a door re-hung so it no longer sagged. He began to feel his body change. Muscles returned where atrophy had claimed them. His breath came steadier at altitude. Nights grew easier too. Dreams still came. Sand, fire, shouts, but less often. The mountain silence, once so alien, began to feel like balm. Archie thrived. The dog ranged the clearing by day, ears sharp, tail a dark flag among the weeds, but always returned to Natan's side when he paused. He seemed to sense danger before it arrived, his growl warning of approaching storms or wandering wildlife. In the evenings, he lay close by the hearth, warm and content, a silent anchor for his recovering master. Natan sometimes thought the dog understood more than words could carry, as if they shared a bond deeper than Handler and K9 ever had in the field. There were still nights of doubt. Sometimes, as he sat alone by the fire, leg wrapped in a heating pad, hands rough and bleeding from work, the old voices returned. "You are broken. You failed. This will never be enough." But each dawn he rose and found another task to do, another piece of the lodge to reclaim. And with every swing of the hammer, every board set in place, those voices grew weaker. By the end of that long season, the garage was fully functional, and the Jeep miraculously roared to life after months of patient tinkering. The first sputter of its engine echoed through the clearing like applause. Natan sat behind the wheel, hand trembling slightly on the shifter, and felt a swell of pride that threatened to choke him. It wasn't just a machine running. It was proof that he could still bring something dead back to working life. He took Archie on a slow drive down the road and back, the dog's head out the window, ears whipping in the wind. They returned to the clearing with the smell of oil and hope lingering in the air. The lodge itself was far from ready to welcome anyone. Only a portion of the roof was sound, and the interior remained raw and half-reclaimed. But it no longer looked like a corpse. It looked like a patient recovering, one careful step at a time. Natan stood one evening on the patched porch, cane in hand, and watched the sunset bleed across the peaks. The pain in his leg was sharp, but it no longer felt like defeat. It was simply part of the cost of living. He realized, slowly, that the mountain was changing him as much as he was changing the lodge. He had arrived hollow and unsure if he wanted to keep going. Now, though still fragile, he felt the stirrings of something close to strength. Archie leaned against his side, gaze fixed on the forest edge where shadows gathered. Natan reached down and scratched the dog's ears, and for the first time since leaving the battlefield, he felt a quiet certainty that tomorrow was worth building toward. The work was only beginning, but so was he. Spring came to the mountains in slow, hesitant breaths. One morning, Natan woke to the sound of dripping water, not from leaks, but from snowmelt trickling off the roof he had rebuilt. The meadow around the lodge began to shed its white blanket, revealing the brown grass and stones beneath. Tiny shoots of green poked through, tentative but determined, and the creek behind the property swelled with clear, icy water. After the long winter of sweat and solitude, the change felt almost like permission to dream again. Natan stood on the patched porch with his cup of coffee, leaning on the cane that had become less of a crutch and more of a tool, and let the sun warm his face. For months he had lived as though the mountain might reject him at any moment. Now, with the thaw, it seemed to be offering acceptance. The lodge still bore its scars. Only a handful of rooms were safe to enter, and the walls remained stripped to their bones in most places. Yet the grand hall no longer reeked of damp and decay. He had rebuilt the hearth until it roared with a clean, steady fire, and each night Archie stretched before it, content and warm. Natan had carved out a makeshift kitchen with salvaged cabinets and a propane stove, and though the food was simple, the act of cooking in a place he had reclaimed felt like victory. The roof held against the spring rains, and the Jeep miracle of rust and persistence now carried him to the small town down the mountain for supplies without fear of breaking down. Piece by piece, he had turned ruin into shelter. But spring brought something else Natan hadn't expected, the possibility of other people. For so long he had imagined this project as a solitary pursuit, almost a penance for the failure and violence behind him. Yet one crisp afternoon, while he was hauling cut timber from the tree line, Archie suddenly stopped, ears stiff, nose twitching toward the winding road. Natan followed the dog's gaze and soon heard it too. The crunch of boots on gravel, the creak of a backpack strap. Out from the trees stepped a man in weathered hiking gear, face flushed from the climb. He looked startled to see smoke curling from the lodge's chimney and an actual figure standing among the half-restored structures. The hiker approached slowly, raising a hand in greeting, wary but curious. His name was Ben, a photographer traveling alone who had gotten turned around following an old map. Natan, though awkward at first after so many months without conversation, offered water and a seat on the porch. Ben looked around with wide eyes, taking in the repaired roof and the sturdy porch rails beside the sections still in ruin. He spoke of how he'd heard of Pine Summit as an abandoned landmark, a place hikers used for shelter when storms rolled in. Seeing it alive again seemed to surprise and delight him. Before he left the next morning, after camping nearby, he thanked Natan quietly and said there was something comforting about finding a place being brought back to life, rather than left to rot. That encounter lingered with Natan long after the man disappeared down the trail. He realized how much he had missed ordinary human exchange, stripped of pity or curiosity about his injury. Ben hadn't looked at him as broken. He had simply seen someone rebuilding a lodge. The thought was strangely healing. More visitors came as the season deepened. Some were accidental wanderers, hikers caught by sudden mountain storms, who followed smoke or light to the lodge. Natan let them warm themselves by the fire, shared coffee or simple meals, and accepted their quiet gratitude. Archie, protective but gentle, would trot to greet them, sniff backpacks with calm authority, and then settle nearby like a sentry. People often reached out to scratch his ears, smiling as though the dog's steady presence reassured them that this forgotten place was safe. Each time strangers came and went, Natan found his old instinct to retreat lessening. He still valued silence, but it no longer felt like a fortress. It felt like a home that could open its door. Practical needs soon pushed him toward deeper contact with the nearby community. The Jeep, though running, needed parts he couldn't find online, and the work ahead required lumber, glass, and fittings too large for his small supply runs. On one trip down the mountain, he stopped at the hardware store that had once supplied his roofing panels. The grizzled owner, Pete, had noticed his repeated visits and asked in his laconic way what he was building. When Natan mentioned the old lodge, the man's eyebrows rose. "That place?" he said with a faint smile. "Haven't heard of anyone trying to bring it back since your granddad." There was no ridicule in his voice, only surprise. Pete began to set aside supplies Natan might need, sometimes throwing in advice about how to brace beams or handle pests in mountain structures. Through Pete, he met others. An old mechanic named Carl helped him source rare Jeep parts and even drove up one afternoon to lend a hand, installing a replacement axle. A retired forest ranger stopped by after hearing of the work and offered warnings about the local bear population, teaching Natan how to read claw marks on trees and scat on trails. These exchanges were brief but grounding. Each small kindness chipped away at the isolation that had defined his first months on the mountain. Inside the lodge, transformation continued. Natan poured himself into making the main hall more than just habitable. He sanded the rough floors until the boards glowed warm gold under lamplight. He salvaged beams from a collapsed outbuilding to craft a long, communal table. From the few old photographs his grandfather had left behind, he rebuilt small touches. The carved banister, the wooden sign above the hearth bearing the lodge's name. At night, exhausted but satisfied, he would sit with Archie and stare into the fire, imagining future guests drying boots by this same glow. By midsummer, a section of rooms on the lower floor was restored enough to sleep in. Simple but clean. Fresh painted walls, solid beds built from reclaimed timber, patched windows that opened to the scent of pine. Natan hadn't planned to host anyone, but when a pair of drenched hikers arrived one stormy evening, looking miserable and lost, he couldn't send them back into the night. He let them stay, offering coffee and spare blankets. They left in the morning, beaming, promising to tell others about the man and his dog saving a ruined lodge in the high country. Word traveled faster than Natan expected. At first it was just a trickle, a lone backpacker asking if he might refill water, a young couple stopping by to ask about camping nearby. But soon small groups came, drawn by rumors of a safe, quiet haven up the ridge. They didn't expect luxury, just a roof and warmth, and perhaps a story from the man who lived there. Natan found himself improvising, charging small amounts to cover supplies, grateful but cautious. He didn't want the place to lose its soul to crowds. Yet seeing people sit at his table, boots drying by the hearth, laughter echoing where only silence had reigned, filled him with a quiet pride he hadn't felt since long before the war. Archie became the heart of these encounters. The dog seemed to sense each guest's temperament immediately. Nervous travelers found his calm gaze soothing. Children squealed with delight as he leaned into their hands. Even the most weary adults softened under his watch. Often, Natan caught guests staring at Archie while stroking his ears, their faces easing from city tension into mountain calm. The dog had been his partner in war and solitude, and now he was becoming a bridge to the world. Not everything was easy. Natan still wrestled with pain, especially on long workdays. Bureaucratic hurdles loomed when he tried to register the lodge officially. County inspectors frowned at some of his DIY repairs, forcing him to redo parts with more rigor. Money remained tight. Every improvement paid for, with careful rationing of his pension and whatever modest fees guests left behind. But the difference now was that he didn't face these challenges as a man crushed by failure. He faced them as a builder with purpose. Each setback was a task to solve, not a verdict. He also faced moments of vulnerability he hadn't anticipated. One evening after a long day of repairs, a guest asked innocently why he had chosen such an isolated life. The question caught Natan off guard. He mumbled something about wanting peace, but inside the memories surged. The explosion, the hospital, the empty city apartment where no one called. For hours after they'd gone to bed, he sat awake by the fire, wrestling with old ghosts. Yet when dawn came and Archie pressed close, Natan realized the pain was lighter than before. Speaking even vaguely about his journey had not shattered him. It had simply reminded him of how far he'd come. As summer edged toward autumn, the lodge felt alive in a way Natan hadn't dared hope. Smoke curled from its chimney on cool nights. Lights glowed softly through repaired windows. Visitors came and went, leaving behind small tokens: a thank you note, a jar of homemade jam, a carved walking stick. Online, hikers began sharing photos of the revived Pine Summit Lodge's rustic charm, the kindness of its caretaker, and the noble black and tan shepherd who greeted everyone at the porch steps. Reviews called it a hidden gem, a place of unexpected refuge. One evening, after helping a couple fix a broken bootstrap and sharing supper with a group of exhausted backpackers, Natan stepped outside alone. The sky blazed with stars, clear and sharp above the dark ridge. The smell of wood smoke lingered on his clothes. Inside, quiet laughter drifted from the hall, where guests lingered around the fire. Archie padded out to join him, leaning against his leg. Natan looked at the glowing windows and felt a swell of something long lost. Not just survival, but belonging. He had built a place that others found comfort in. He had built a life that had room again for connection. He thought of the man who had limped into this clearing months before, hollow with pain and anger, believing he was finished. That man would not have believed this scene possible. A warm lodge, friendly strangers gathered under its roof, the night safe and full of promise. The transformation wasn't complete. His body still ached, his past still heavy, but it was undeniable. The ruin had become a home, and in some quiet, essential way, so had he. Autumn arrived with a patient, deliberate grace, painting the slopes around Pine Summit Lodge in deep gold and amber. Natan Ellis stood on the porch one early morning as fog lifted off the meadow and the first frost silvered the grasses. Smoke curled upward from the great hearth inside, and he could hear the low crackle of the fire he had built before dawn. Behind him, the lodge was quiet except for the faint stir of guests waking slowly after a night of mountain cold. Archie sat beside him, ears pricked, muzzle now touched with gray, but eyes still bright and alert. Together they watched the light gather in the valley and spill upward toward the peaks. It struck Natan how different this moment felt from the day he had first driven up the broken road. Then the place had been ruin and silence, a reflection of his own battered self. Now it was alive, warm, and waiting to receive strangers who came weary and left a little lighter. The seasons of work had given way to a kind of steady rhythm. The lodge, once on the verge of collapse, now functioned fully, if still humbly. The main hall gleamed with polished wood and the glow of firelight each evening. Several guest rooms were clean and sturdy, with patchwork quilts and fresh pine-scented air drifting through opened windows. The repaired kitchen served simple but hearty meals that Natan cooked himself stews, fresh bread baked in a refurbished oven, strong coffee at dawn. The Jeep waited in the garage like a faithful horse, ready to haul supplies or carry stranded travelers back to the valley. Outside, he had carved paths through the undergrowth, built a small woodshed, and set up bear-proof storage that even the boldest creatures couldn't break into. The lodge wasn't luxury, it was honest refuge, and that was exactly what its guests came seeking. Natan's life had grown into this new shape, almost without his noticing. Each day held its demands: chopping wood before the sun rose high, repairing something that the mountain weather had gnawed at, tending to visitors who arrived dusty and wide-eyed. Sometimes they stayed just one night. Sometimes they lingered for days, soaking in the quiet, learning how to light a fire or patch a torn pack under his calm instruction. He had become, almost accidentally, a teacher and a host. The man who once couldn't bear even a casual conversation in town now found himself explaining trail routes, showing guests how to brew strong coffee over open flame, or listening quietly when they shared stories of jobs that drained them, marriages ending, lives shifting beneath their feet. He didn't give advice. He didn't feel qualified, but something in his presence, scarred yet steady, seemed to reassure them that starting over was possible. There were evenings when the lodge filled with quiet conversation. Guests gathered at the long table he had built from salvaged beams. A hiker recovering from burnout in the city might trade tales with a young couple testing their first long trek, or a writer would sit scribbling in a corner, while Archie lay underfoot, basking in the warmth. Natan often stood back during those moments, leaning against the doorway, a dish towel slung over one shoulder. He would watch the firelight dance across faces softened by fatigue and comfort, and he felt something almost forgotten. Pride not born of medals or contracts or wealth, but of usefulness. He had created a space where people could breathe again. Inside himself, changes had taken deeper root than he realized. The physical pain in his leg remained. It would never leave. Yet it no longer defined him. He had learned how to work with it, pacing himself, resting when necessary, and adapting tasks to his limits. The sharp, searing ache that once felt like defeat now registered only as a quiet reminder of what he had survived. More profound was the shift in his mind. The nightmares of war still surfaced, especially on nights when storms echoed with distant thunder, but they no longer left him shaking and hollow. Here, surrounded by timber, he had set with his own hands, and the living breath of the forest beyond. Those memories had become part of his story, rather than his cage. Sometimes, alone at night after guests had gone to bed, Natan would sit by the great hearth and think of the road that had brought him here. He remembered the man who had limped into this clearing nearly broken, believing he had lost all worth because he could no longer serve as he once did. That man had measured himself by battles and paychecks, by a kind of strength that couldn't survive failure. The man now staring into the fire had learned a different truth, that worth could be rebuilt in silence, in sweat, in small acts of creation that nobody applauded but still mattered. He felt no need for the city's approval, no hunger for recognition. His success was quieter now, measured in warm rooms on cold nights, in the grateful eyes of travelers, in Archie's steady companionship. Word of the lodge continued to spread in small but meaningful ways. A local hiking group began recommending it as a safe waypoint. A few articles appeared in regional outdoor blogs, describing a veteran who had restored his grandfather's mountain inn and opened it to those seeking respite. Hikers posted pictures online, the massive hearth glowing against log walls, steaming mugs of coffee at a long wooden table, Archie greeting them with noble calm. Bookings were never overwhelming. Natan preferred it that way, but steady enough to keep supplies coming and the work sustainable. The lodge had become what he had secretly hoped it might, a sanctuary, both for him and for those wandering toward new lives of their own. One early winter, a young man arrived alone, shoulders hunched under a heavy pack. He was quiet and withdrawn, avoiding eye contact, speaking little. Over the course of several days, Natan noticed how the man slowly relaxed. Sharing small smiles with other guests, letting Archie nudge his hand, sitting nearer the fire. On his last night, he lingered by the door before leaving and simply said, "Thank you. I needed this." Then he was gone, leaving behind only a neatly folded note of gratitude. Moments like that struck Natan deeply. He realized that the pain he had carried out of war, the long battle to reclaim his life, now served as unspoken proof for others, that even from ruin, something whole could be made again. Running the lodge brought its own steady challenges. Winter storms could still batter the roof and close the road for days. Bears occasionally tested his storage, despite every precaution. Bureaucratic letters from the county sometimes demanded upgrades or safety checks. His body still reminded him of its limits, with sudden, punishing flares of pain. But he met these difficulties differently now. Each one was a problem to solve, not a wall to stop him. The man who had once felt powerless now knew his own capability. Slowly, a deep peace had replaced the restless urge to flee. Archie grew older in those years, but remained his unwavering partner. The dog knew every inch of the property, every scent along the ridge. He greeted guests with a tail wag that carried quiet dignity, not the frantic joy of a pet, but the calm welcome of a guardian. Children adored him. Adults trusted him instinctively. At night, he slept near the hearth or on the porch under the stars, rising at the slightest strange noise. More than once, when Natan felt the old weight of loneliness creep back, Archie's steady presence was enough to remind him that he was not alone. One clear September morning, Natan rose before dawn and brewed coffee, while the world outside was still blue with night. He stepped onto the porch, mug warming his hands, and breathed in the crisp air that promised the first snows were only weeks away. The meadow glowed faintly with frost, and beyond it, the forest blazed with early gold. Inside, quiet snores and shifting bedsheets told of guests resting after long hikes. Archie padded out and sat beside him, leaning gently against his leg. Together, they watched the sky lighten and a hawk spiral high above the valley. Natan thought of the long road behind him, the violent explosion that had nearly taken his life, the empty city apartment where he had felt like a ghost, the broken ruin of this lodge when he first arrived. He thought of the months of pain and labor, of nights when he almost gave up, of storms and bears and loneliness. And then he looked at what now stood around him, a living lodge, a warm hearth, people finding solace where he had once sought only escape. The understanding settled over him quietly but firmly. He had not just built a refuge for others, he had built himself anew. He no longer wished for the life he had lost. The war, the old career, even the city's measure of success felt distant, like someone else's story. He had discovered a different kind of wealth, one that couldn't be taken by injury or bankruptcy or abandonment. It lived in self-reliance, in meaningful work, in the ability to offer shelter and calm to strangers who arrived as he once had, tired, uncertain, searching. As the sun finally broke over the peaks and poured light across the lodge, Natan felt a quiet certainty settle in his chest. The man who had come here defeated was gone, replaced by someone stronger, not because he could fight or build without pain, but because he had learned to live with it and keep going anyway. Archie shifted closer, and Natan rested a hand on the dog's broad head, feeling the familiar warmth beneath his palm. Whatever the day would bring, a roof repair, new guests, another storm rolling in, they would face it together. Behind them, the lodge stirred awake, the murmur of voices, the soft thud of boots on wood floors, the laughter of someone discovering the first frost outside. Life moved forward, quiet and steady, built nail by nail, day by day, out of ruins and silence. Natan took another sip of coffee, watching the mist rise off the valley. He had not only survived, he had created a place where others could too. The mountain, once an exile, had become his home, and in its enduring stillness, he had finally found his own. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story. Take a moment to watch the next video waiting for you right now. There are more stories worth discovering. And share this video with friends and family. Some journeys are too meaningful to keep to yourself.